Welcome to the session entitled, Does the Rule of Law Matter to Public Health? Of course it does, so we'll get that over with very quickly and talk about exactly how and what we could do to further our public health interests. This is a question to start. We have one legal expert and two public health people on the panel. Do you raise your hand if you come from a public health or medical or health background? Very good. Anybody have a legal background? Okay, am I missing anybody? Very good. So one of the principles I liked the best that was espoused at the plenary session this morning was that lawyers talking to lawyers will not advance the rule of law until, in our case, public health practitioners and engineers and environmental specialists begin touting and talking about the importance of the rule of law. It won't mean anything. And so the attorneys who are here, the judges who are here, need those of us from other disciplines to advance the cause of the rule of law. My name is Harris Pastides. I'm from Colombia, South Carolina. We also have someone from Colombia on the panel, a different one. Both named, I think, for Christopher Columbus, in any event. I am an epidemiologist and former dean of the School of Public Health at the University of South Carolina and currently president of the university. And I'm extremely honored to have two distinguished panelists with me. First of all, the Honorable Oagile Bethuel Dingake. So the hard part for me is over now for this presentation. But Justice Dingake has served both as judge of the High Court of Botswana since 2005 and as a judge of the Residual Special Court of Sierra Leone since 2013. And I know we have an audience member here, Joel, who is very closely connected to Sierra Leone. He has also served as a judge of the Industrial Court of Botswana from 2002 to 2005. He is known for facilitating seminars in the region and internationally on diverse topics, ranging from the vital importance of the independence of the judiciary, gender equity, sexual reproductive health rights, HIV, tuberculosis, and exactly why the law matters to ensuring access to control measures for these diseases. Prior to being a judge, he taught law at the University of Botswana and continues his academic interests. He's an honorary professor of public law at the University of Cape Town, where he received his doctoral degree. He received his LLM from the University of London and also his LLB from the University of Botswana. He is the author of several books. Next to him, and we will start with Dr. Pinzon in a moment, Dr. Angela Pinzon, who is professor of medicine at the Universidad del Rosario in Bogota, Colombia. She is in the School of Medicine and Health Sciences. She is the director of the Master of Public Health program there, and her main interests focus on the social determinants of health. And she has looked at intercultural studies of vulnerable communities in developing nations around the world. Angela has been doing research, and we'll start with you now, if that's okay, Angela, on the index, or what I'll call our index of the rule of law, which is a vitally important, I would say, summarization of how nations are doing with respect to the rule of law. And so before we talk about the specifics about how to use law as a tool or as a weapon in the advancement of public health generally, let's ask Angela what she has found in her primary research examining the question, is the rule of law correlated and predictive of positive health outcomes in communities and societies? So Angela, will you start with this topic?
Thank you. Yes, of course. We conducted our research on 96 countries, and what we did was try to correlate the rule of law with some health outcomes. We use infant mortality rate, maternal mortality rate, life expectancy, and mortality rates from cardiovascular disease and diabetes. And we correlated that with the rule of law in general and with 8 sub-factors of the rule of law. What we found was a correlation between the rule of law and the health outcomes. So the better the rule of law, the better the health outcomes. More life expectancy, less infant mortality, less maternal mortality, and less mortality from cardiovascular diseases and diabetes. This is an ecological study, so that means that we did it with the measures from countries, not individuals, which can give us a fallacy, of course. We cannot talk about causality with this type of study. But we had a big sample, 96 countries representing above 92% of the world population. And we control for many other variables, macroeconomic variables such as income per capita, inequalities, Gini coefficients, freedom, health expenditure, size of the population, and we found that even after controlling for these other factors, the rule of law was still correlated with the health outcomes. Again, this study cannot talk about causality, but we have 3 different mechanisms that can explain why the rule of law could be associated directly with health. And one of them is corruption. So as you can imagine, corruption destroys the health of the populations. For instance, if I work in maternal and child health, and we have found that in some countries, we use oxytocin. For those of you that know are doctors, when a mother delivers a baby, bleeding is one of the biggest problems, and we use oxytocin to stop the bleeding. And from time to time, that is not oxytocin, but just water. So imagine trying to stop a bleeding with water, another real medication, just because the government, the officials were corrupt and didn't buy the right medication to gain some money by themselves. So this is one of the mechanisms. Another one is the enforcement of health as a right. And you can see that in many cases as well. But let's put an example. For instance, in the smoking policies. So now in most of the places of the world, it's forbidden to smoke in public places. So that is actually protecting the health of populations. So that's something that can be done with the rule of law. And the other mechanism is through equity. So if we treat all the population in the same way, we can get better health outcomes. As an example, we can see, for instance, Saudi Arabia, where women have different rights than men, and they cannot decide on their own reproductive health. And we see that these women have higher infant and maternal mortality rates than other countries with the same development. So there are many things that can be done health-wise with the rule of law.
Let me jump in right away and ask a question. If you remember Bill Newcomb's presentation this morning when he had the graph of economic, I don't know if it was GDP, I don't recall, on the x-axis and rule of law, if you will, scoring on the y. I think it was that way. There is a strong correlation already, Angela, between nations that are economically more developed. Scandinavian countries come to mind. I remember Norway was at the top of the line. And also with having a high score of the index of rule of law. everyone would expect that Norway would have better health outcomes as well, regardless maybe of its rule of law status. So I'm interested in the countries, and I don't know if you looked at this, where there may be lower economic development, let's say lower GDP, but higher status on the rule of law. And on the other side, nations, in fact, who might be affluent, if you will, but have lower standing on the rule of law. I think those are the countries that would tell us whether, in fact, it was some socioeconomic determinants of infant mortality rate, or is it truly the rule of law?
We look a little bit about on those countries. Actually, the correlation between the rule of law and the GDP is very high, and same for the health outcomes. They are all correlated highly. But for instance, you can take Cuba, and this is actually Cuba was not in the study, but it's a nice example to show how the way in which you manage your health system and your society can change the outcomes independently of the gross domestic product and independently of the rule of law. So we discussed about that. Let me think about other examples.
What I'm trying to get to is, as public health professionals, should we be working to improve the rule of law in our nations, or should we be working more fundamentally on improving, let's say, access to maternal and child health services if we only have so much energy? Should the public health community be, let's say, distracted from working on implementing public health measures, because fundamentally they should be working on advancing the rule of law?
That's a hard question. I see you should be working in both.
I knew she would say that.
But yeah, for sure, you should be working in both. Our hypothesis, our theory on the research is that the rule of law is like a foundational determinant of health. So it's a determinant of the determinants of health. So if you change the rule of law, there are many other things that are going to change by changing the rule of law, including it's the same as the some macroeconomic factors. So in a way, it will give you a lot of results in the end, but changing the rule of law is extremely hard as well. So, but it will give you a lot of outcomes, not only one, but many in the long run, because
Very good.
it determines many different things. But of course, you still need to work on public health measures at the same time.
I bet there are comments and or questions on this topic, but let's hold them for a moment and let's give the judge an opportunity to take us to a different part of the spectrum of the importance of rule of law to public health. The judge has an interesting case study to tell us about a case he recently had to adjudicate relative to access to HIV treatment. Would you be kind enough to tell us that, Judge?
Thank you very much, moderator. The rule of law is a complex concept. It means many things, even different things to lawyers, to judges, various legal regimes, and even scholars, as to exactly what constitutes the rule of law. But at the heart of the concept, the rule of law, we are really talking about a society based on laws, laws that regulate human behavior, a society in which no person is above the law. But to say that is also problematic, because law is capable of bad and good. We know that we can have bad laws. In fact, in the area of HIV, we have an epidemic of bad laws. And these bad laws do not facilitate better health outcomes. But for the purpose of my presentation today, and for purely functional purposes, when I talk about the rule of law, I'm talking about a rule-based society and the rules that respect human rights, in which there exists an independent judiciary that is strong on rights. A judiciary that is able to hold the executive and other private entities like pharmaceutical companies accountable. That's what I mean by the rule of law, for purpose of today's discussion alone. And having said that, I must say that I therefore come from that angle in approaching the topic today. As it has been already said, I'm a judge, so the only thing I understand better is cases and disputes. And the judge finally saying this is the line. So that is the context. And before I go into the case in point, I must point out that I also happen to chair an entity called the African Think Tank on HIV, Health, and Social Justice. This is actually a broad-based body made up of experts from across the continent. There are judges there, there are medical doctors there are civil society activists, members of key populations across the board that try to link rights to social justice, to better health outcomes. To say that if you do respect rights, that any response, this is in the context of HIV, that any effective HIV response must be founded on rights. And that without respecting rights, then the response is likely to be ineffective. And the global agenda to end HIV by 2030 will not come to fruition if the rule of law is not operative. So that is the context, really. There are many other cases in Botswana, some of which I did, and in other countries that actually show that in a country based on laws, not just laws, good laws. And what I mean by good laws, I mean laws that respect rights. Laws that do not leave anyone out because of sexual orientation, gender identity, and some other irrational and unfair distinction that we know is common. Such laws deliver better health outcomes. I'll take an example of the case that he is making reference to. The policy in the years past, not now because of this court intervention, in Botswana was that foreign prisoners were not who test HIV positive and meet the threshold to be enrolled on treatment would not be treated because they are foreigners. Botswana prisoners would be given treatment because they are Botswana, because the government said it has no resources, it has no money to cater for non-citizens. So we had a situation in which foreign prisoners who were HIV positive had reached the requisite CD4 count and needed the medication badly, were denied because they were foreigners. So in the case that I mentioned, in the case of Gift Moale, he simply approached the court. This was a Zimbabwean national imprisoned in Botswana. Approached the court and said, I'm a foreign national, a citizen of Zimbabwe, I'm HIV positive. In terms of the policy of government, I can't be availed ARVs, yet other Botswana prisoners who are going to be here and then live and interact with the community, just as I will do, and endanger the public or potentially endanger the public are given treatment, and I'm not. The first problem that was encountered was that he was unfamiliar with court procedures and the law. He actually simply almost wrote the registrar a letter complaining what is the problem. And the court had to found a pro bono counsel, in other words, a lawyer who would not charge him any fees. So that director of proceedings also implicates the question, which is encapsulated in the rule of law, of access to the court. It encapsulates the issue of legal aid, legal resources to enable someone to come and complain in the courts. And the government came and said, sorry, we don't have, our resources are limited. We can only attend to our people, and you happen not to be. And the policy of the Botswana government is that we can't, and no court can force us to do so. The court adjudicated the matter and said, no, it's not permissible to discriminate, because in terms of the Constitution of Botswana, every person is entitled to the fundamental rights. It says every person, doesn't say every citizen, which is critical. And in fact, the Botswana Constitution does not talk about, there's no reference to the right to health. And that's one other important thing. There's no reference to the right to health. There is reference to the right to life. And the court read, subsumed under the right to life, the right to health. Because we know the consequence of being denied the ARV treatment. You will die. So that denial was a denial of the right to life. And so the court pronounced, among other reasons. And as a result, it directed the government to give the prisoner, and necessarily all foreign prisoners, ARVs. And the government complied, which is an important feature of the rule of law. Because the rule of law does not only mean the existence of laws and the existence of the courts that must be independent, it also means that the courts must give decisions that are capable of enforcement. So it was also a good rule of law measure or indicator that after the executive was told by the court that you shall, and you will not plead financial incapacity not to do so, the government did so. I think for now, I should stop here because I have other cases to demonstrate further the importance of the rule of law and why the rule of law engenders better health outcomes. And that is only if you have independent courts, you have laws that are based on human rights, and the approach of the courts is human rights approach, and the government is not above the law, it will listen to the courts, and the rules will be enforced. Thank you.
Thank you. Health is not constitutionally guaranteed in every country. It is, however, in some. In South Africa, as I'm aware, in Brazil, in other countries, not in the United States, by the way, although life, there's a guarantee to life and liberty, but not to health per se. In the United States, we are facing the potential of a massive disenrollment of people to health services based on Medicaid being largely made smaller, if you will. And so, yet we do not in the United States have a right to protest this based on any guarantee, if you will, that individuals have any access to health services or even to good health. Now, having said that, I'm not sure that in nations where health is constitutionally guaranteed, it necessarily means that there's more responsiveness. But if we move down the scale from law to regulation, I can think of so many conditions, food safety being one, and other aspects of environmental degradation, environmental quality, safe drinking water, for example, where it almost doesn't matter what the laws say, but the local regulations and the enforcement of those regulations are much more important to the people who live in communities. And that brings me to a question maybe we can all think about, which is the maldistribution of healthcare resources, and how law, how the courts, if you will, and how regulations can be used to bring more equity to that very important issue. And so, Angela, I know you have studied communities, disadvantaged communities in South America and in other nations, and I believe you have found as well that communities where there is greater violence, for example, also, for some reason, beyond violence itself, have worse health outcomes. Why do you think that is?
I think in vulnerable communities, in violent communities in this case, it's difficult to get medical attention or any type of health attention simply because the violent groups don't allow health personnel to come to this community. So it happens to us not only as medical providers, but also as researchers, that we are not allowed to enter some communities in Colombia in particular. So these communities don't have the right to health services, or they are supposed to have it, but actually it's not possible for them to get it. Another thing is that in these communities, there are some places, even in Bogota, in some neighborhoods, that police officers are not allowed to get in. So imagine this is something that is ruled by these violent groups, by gang members, and not by any rule of law. So they decide on the health of this population, on who can get out, who can get in, who's getting medical attention, who is not. So it's independently of them of the injuries that violence causes. Of course, violence is associated with health outcomes. In addition, we have found differences in the cortisol levels of people living in populations that are violent as compared with those living in populations that are non-violent. So probably living in a violent population activates all your stress hormones, and so when you are living in a population that is affected by violence, your immunity, your system, your health, your body doesn't work in the same way in which your body will work if it was living in a very peaceful and calm environment. So you are kind of in an alert stage all the time, and this will definitely have some effects on your health. There are some studies, I haven't conducted any of these studies, but that show how a person that has been affected by violence, especially if that person was affected during childhood, produces changes on her brain, and those changes are permanent. They are lifetime changes in the brain. So this could be probably, for sure, people that are living in violent communities are getting affected only by their endocrine system, their nervous systems, and plus lack of services, plus the possibility to get an injury. So there are different mechanisms.
Shall we pause and ask the audience for some input as well? What might be on your mind, William?
I want to go back to the whole concept of this, whether there's a cause and effect, whether or not the rule of law leads to better health outcomes, or whether a healthier society where there's good early childhood education and health care leads to more productive citizens and the avoidance of that kind of scarring that you're talking about. So is it really fairer to say that good health and the rule of law are mutually reinforcing, rather than try to say that there's a rather than say that there's some cause and effect. I think you can turn the equation around. I guess I'm suggesting, and say, if there's better health, more emphasis on health, good health. Now in the instance of the misallocation or malallocation of drugs, where you're in a corrupt environment and the vaccines are stolen and put on the black market, you can see the clear correlation in the cause and effect. But it seems to me in other situations, if you provide the good health care and you emphasize the good health care, that sort of leads people to have more productive lives, able to learn more, appreciate the importance of rule of law, be more sustainable economically. So I just would like for you to elaborate on what your research is. Maybe honest, I think your research probably is addressed to that issue in some ways, so maybe you could elaborate just a bit.
Yes, that's completely true. I mean, we know that it's a correlation, but we don't know what is causing what, for sure. And it's like what we call a vicious cycle in some of the vulnerable communities, that you don't know where to start to break it, because you don't know if it is education, if it is money, if it is the rule of law, if it is culture. What is it that gets you in this situation of vulnerability? If it is health. Because in these populations, I work in a neighborhood in Bogota that is called El Codito, and we live very close to that neighborhood, in the same locality. The infant and maternal mortality rate of El Codito are similar to the infant and mortality rates in Sierra Leone. And the infant and mortality rate in Santa Barbara, that is, I would say, like 20 minutes away from El Codito, is the same as the infant and mortality rate in Sweden. So the inequalities in Bogota are amazing. I take my students with me to do these social programs and to see these patients. And when we are in El Codito, we see diseases that you usually don't see in the rest of Bogota, such as very bad cases of TB, very bad cases of whooping cough, for instance. We had 12 babies dying like 6 months ago for whooping cough that is supposed to be preventable and easy to treat, and still there were so many babies dying there. And so they asking me at some point, there have to be an environmental poison in this community. We have to look for something. It has to be some heavy metal, something that is really poison in this community. And I don't think this is the case. What I was telling them, I don't think it's anything like that. It's just poverty. It's just lack of resources. It's just violence. It's just lack of the rule of law. It's lack of education, lack of opportunities. So you see, and they're very different in the same city, very close together. They're very different situations. And all that we know is that in this neighborhood where the health outcomes are bad, there is also poverty, there is also lack of the rule of law, there is also violence, there are gangs, there is ruled by gang members. It's a situation that comes all together. I wouldn't be able to say what caused what. It's just entangled on that.
Let me ask Juan if it's a fair question of an example of let's say two countries that are not on the line, where the correlation, the well-known correlation between economic development and rule of law is very direct. But there must be some countries that are off that line a fair amount. And I'd be curious to know if their health index, if their health status were closer to the countries that were around it economically, or closer to the health status of the countries with a similar rule of law.
Yes, President Pastides, I believe, let's say Costa Rica, for instance, is a country that its level of adherence to the rule of law is higher than its level of economic development. Mm-hmm. I do not know the health indices in Costa Rica, but I'm sure Angela probably knows that.
Yeah, Costa Rica. Yeah, Costa Rica is, I think that the health are closer to the rule of law than to the economic development.
And Cuba, I know, has not been measured, but you would expect that as well.
That as well, same as well.
Yeah, I mean, that gets to your, Mr. Hubbard's question about whether we shouldn't be thinking of all of this as a connected argument rather than predictive, you know, that one is directly predictive of the other. Public health professionals are always wondering, well, should we address the underlying poverty? Is that the best thing we can do? Or should we bring better nutrition, let's say, to mothers and infants? And because addressing poverty is so difficult to do, we kind of say, you know, we'll leave that to somebody else. Let's focus on what we can and give food stamps and, you know, clean water, if you will, to mothers in rural India. And so I think, you know, it's unlikely that the rule of law per se is the direct predictor of health status. But I do think working together, the public health community with the legal community and with governments in general must be done better. I think we have a lack of dialogue today, and I think our disciplines are not well connected. Coming from the health side, I would say law is obscure to many people, not in the legal profession. People grow up knowing what a doctor is, what a nurse is, what a dentist is. People do not necessarily grow up knowing, they may know lawyers, but they may not really know what a judge or lawyers do. So I think together, this project, we need to break down, if you will, the communication barriers, as we're doing today, to make these two communities, wouldn't you agree, Judge, to make them more...
I agree. I was at, I attended a law degree, an LLB curriculum review strategy at University of Zimbabwe some years back. And one of the main things that emerged was how there is no connectivity between law, public health, medicine, and economics, at least in the part of the world where I come from. And that it is time, actually, that we deliberately cultivate synergies and understanding of the interconnectedness of all these disciplines in order to effect, even in the what we are talking about, better health outcomes. You know, the law usually waits for trouble. And the law and the judges don't call upon calling people that come, but it waits like a last resort. So I agree with the thesis that we must see all these various determinants as more reinforcing. The law playing a supportive role where it can. In corrupt situations, for instance, where medicines are not reaching people and there is a lot of wastage, a strong judiciary and can help mitigate the real harm that goes out there. And in countries where socioeconomic rights are entrenched in constitutions, where the judiciary has a part to play in ensuring a more equitable distribution of wealth that has an impact on health, you find that is where the judiciary also plays a role. But the judiciary, it can also be constrained by a number of other factors, because you can't go to the judiciary and say, the main problem we have is poverty, please end poverty. No court order can do that.
But you would write that order if you could. Yes, Professor Samuels.
Good afternoon. I'm fascinated by several angles of this panel, and I have a comment that I'd welcome the reaction of the panel on, which is a slightly different take on the relationship between public health and rule of law. We're talking more at this stage about public health in its, what I would call, long-term impact on society across the board. It has a different relationship occasionally when there are epidemic outbreaks. And I think specifically here to the 2014 Ebola crisis in Sierra Leone, which President Pastides alluded I might ask about. And Judge, I'd be interested if you were there during this period, whether you witnessed this. But during that time, one of the issues, and it has two sides actually, that led to the delay, in particular in Sierra Leone compared to Guinea-Conakry, in resolving the crisis, was a lack of trust in the rural areas, in the villages of the government, and based on corruption, not just corruption, but a history of being mistreated by the central government, and therefore a slower reaction within the communities to allow the government to come in, and particularly and also international organizations to come in to help stem the crisis. So there was a delay that was, I think, very clearly causative related to rule of law. And again, I understand this is an episodic event, but I think it's an interesting maybe case study, because there's a second piece which was less discussed, but I think equally important, which was on the front end, that some of the spread came about in part because there had been, over time, a sustained lack of trust, that same lack of trust that manifested itself most obviously on the back end once the crisis broke out, but that had been part of the process of delaying the growth of public health processes within some of the rural communities. And so I wonder what reactions you all have to that maybe more direct relationship. And Judge, I don't know if you were there during that period at all, but if you were and what you observed. If not, then just generally, I think for the panel, any reactions you have to that maybe more specific case study.
No, actually, the Sierra Leone Special Court, as you know, it sits in Freetown and here in The Hague, and at the height of the epidemic, we're here in The Hague.
Okay.
Yes.
I think that the lack of trust is a very important problem, and you can see it more in epidemics. I agree, everything gets bigger in epidemics, but also in the same neighborhood that I'm telling you in Bogota, there is a lack of trust in the system as well. So I go there, and I've been gaining trust. That's what has been my main purpose with the population, to be able to do any change. So I go as Universidad Rosario, and they respect me and they trust me. But when the medical doctors from the government go there, they are not allowed inside. They break their cars. They steal things from them. There is no trust in the neighborhood, so they are not even allowed entrance to the neighborhood. They are always scared, the nurses and the doctors, from the government, just because they don't have trust. So I have witnessed that problem as well, everywhere when you try to change a community. Same thing when you try to, we were talking about genital mutilation before, and when you go to a community and start talking and telling, no, this is wrong, but if they don't trust you, you are not a figure, I mean, they don't listen to you. There's no way they're gonna listen to any advice, to any education, if you don't gain the trust first, if you don't understand the culture first. So this is something extremely important for sure.
Yes.
I have a question for President Pastides as a president of a large research university. The concern that I see the most is that when I go to medical congresses, there is 5,000 neurologists, and then the 5,000 of them are neurologists, and then general medicine, there is 10,000 medical doctors and nobody else. And legal conferences of the ABA, there is, let's say, 5,000 lawyers. Mm-hmm. And they don't get together. Mm-hmm. And the economists are even perhaps worse. They don't even quote papers from other disciplines. So the question is, how do you break that knowledge silo? Yeah. And how do you do it in your university?
Well, it's hard enough even within the health disciplines. We have 5 health professional schools at our university: medicine, nursing, pharmacy, social work, and public health. And we have been trying for a long time to get one interdisciplinary course in something that would, there are many things that would be relevant across ethics. Medical ethics is one good example. Anatomy is another one. And it's very difficult to get the silos to break down enough unless you try to force it from the top down. But the faculty actually own the curriculum, not the administration, not the board of trustees, but the faculty do. And they always tend to want to go for the more specific, the more specialized, so their students would get the better exams, if you will, on the licensing exams, better scores on the licensing exams to come later. But I do believe we need to start early to get, for example, interdisciplinary conversation, not entire courses, not necessarily 3-credit courses, but conversations going. When I was at the Yale Medical School, my very first semester, I had a course on death and dying. And there was a student from the divinity school, from the law school, from the School of Public Health, and from the medical school, and from the nursing school, and all of us were learning this topic together so we could be more knowledgeable about it. And to this day, I remember that interdisciplinary seminar, and it meant a great deal to me. Does anybody else here have any opinion about that? How we can do a better job at getting our professions to communicate, maybe to grow up respecting each other more so we could work together better? Any thoughts about that? Joel, I could see you're poised, yes?
I would just say,
the Rule of Law Collaborative at the University of South Carolina tries to do exactly that, but we found the challenges, Juan. We've worked very hard. We have 60 faculty across disciplines ranging from social work and public health to law, and all of them identify in their either research or teaching rule of law as a significant component of what they do. And so one thing we do is just get those faculty together and then work on trying to have conversations among them on both research and teaching. The harder piece is having the bigger conversation, right? So what our goal with that initial conversation internally is then to take it and spread it within the disciplines. And so we host a new scholars conference for young scholars coming into academia in different fields to work and learn about other fields. So you're going to have an anthropologist, a political scientist, and a medical doctor all presenting early stage work of their disciplines and then getting feedback from one another. Even though they have come from very different epistemological backgrounds, they're still able to identify key questions and sometimes questions that the others might not have seen. And then the second piece, I think, is to try to bring together groups, which you do here extraordinarily well, who have different experiences and different backgrounds to enter into conversations that are not the traditional conversations. And so when we host symposia on rule of law in youth or rule of law in the environment, much like the sessions you have here, the goal as much as anything is to bring together groups of people who don't traditionally sit together in a room and build out those networks. But I feel like I think one of the things Harris was saying was at the micro level at the university, but it would be very hard. I mean, William could talk about this, but the American Bar Association, the lawyers who belong there, the members of that, have so little free time that to meet with their association is really the cornerstone part. And so to say, well, maybe they should meet once a year with the American Medical Association, that the time isn't there to do that. But if the individual relationships have been built in these smaller settings, then you can penetrate, I think, more slowly. sometimes call it an intellectual insurgency, but sort of breaking down disciplinary barriers by making people realize the connections they have that they may not realize they share. So that's at least one approach that we're trying to take to that.
Yeah, I was going to say that I mentioned about the law curriculum in the part of the world where I come from, and the examples that you gave, again, I think speak to the same idea of total absence of conversation between very critical disciplines that are better off working together. We under the auspices of the UNDP, for instance, to give an example of a small project that the Africa Judges Forum, under the auspices of UNDP, it got together a group of African judges. Actually, they've been meeting over time and being trained, sensitized, and exposed to medicine, to issues of, at a very basic elementary level, issues of TB infection, how it's transmitted and so forth, HIV and many others. Over the last, I think we've been meeting for the last 4 or 5 years. We call it the Africa Judges Forum on HIV, Human Rights and the Law, of which I'm the president. And we have noticed that over time, that exposure has had a direct bearing on the jurisprudence and the case law that they churn out. That is pro-rights, and that understands that judges must function in a world in which they must take heed, one, of empirical research, empirical data, and they must also take heed of development of science. If you compared the period 4 years back when this was not the case, they were not trained, this conversation was not going on between law and medicine with specific reference to certain diseases, the jurisprudence was very underdeveloped and was not informed by science. And right now, the jurisprudence is informed by science with amazing health outcomes, positive health outcomes as a result of this conversation that is taking place.
Other questions or?
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm coming from Berlin, actually, and there in Germany, there are quite a few universities that are using these excellence clusters. They get funding from the government to address particular topics, and they're quite interdisciplinary. And I think as a case study in interdisciplinary work, it's very fascinating to see how they come together around a particular topic, be it Islamic studies or be it some sort of other topic. And I think it's a test case to get people to be in a room together over a PhD program, for instance, and to work in their specific fields, but to come together in research groups and really to push forward particular issues. So I just wanted to give that example.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm from Nepal. I just want to argue the fact that you have been saying that a good rule of law is the one that protects the right of the citizens. Well, there are certain law which believes on the theory that end justifies the means. Now, I would like to draw your attention to the PCPNDT Act of India. Now, this is related to abortion. India legalized abortion in 1972, and in year 2000 they introduced this PCPNDT Act that abolishes sex determination of the fetus, like sex selection. Now, this has created a double standard, and we as a neighboring country, we also legalized abortion in 2002, but sex determination for the purpose of sex selective abortions. Because ours is, and also like India is a patriarchal society where son's preference is very high, and there is a sex ratio imbalance. Sex ratio is skewed towards more number of sons born than the male child born than the female children. And it has been said that in India, in 25 years, there will be 25 million girls missing, and the men will not be having the brides. Now, the PCPNDT Act has become such a government mechanism for monitoring the doctors performing the services. It has denied women's right to abortion access because of the fear that the doctors have been monitored by the government, the state. So a poor woman who wanted to access a safe abortion service in a hospital are returned if she has a daughter, because there is a feeling that she is definitely has done a sex selection somewhere else and coming for the abortion in that hospital. Now, so we need to ensure that if you want to protect the citizens, and also to establish gender justice, means let the daughters also be born, but here you are denying the right of the woman to choose, irrespective of whether she has done PCPNDT or not. That does not matter, but it's a big issue for Nepal, especially in Maharashtra, and even in Nepal now there is a tendency for the women to go for sex selections, and we have a very strong law that imprison both the women and the provider for having a sex determination test and for disclosing the sex of the fetus. So these are some of the conflicting law and human rights policies which is happening in our country and also in South Asia. So how do we address those?
May I ask a question first? I don't know there is an answer for that, by the way, but do you believe that sex selection is the right of a woman? Should that be a right?
The law says no.
And I would guess that's the case. Of course, not to get too into the abortion thing, but it's so the right to choose belongs to a woman in some nations, but not in others. Or in some states, not in others. It can be restricted. But you're talking specifically about the selecting the male child to be born. Okay. Any thought? Anybody here have any thoughts about that?
I think this is a problem of conflicting rights, human rights. So the right of the women and the right of the newborn, and also a gender issue. So it's very hard. I don't think it has an answer.
Mm-hmm. In the United States, we have the conflict between the free, let's say, one of our states has a motto that says, live free or die. We like to say in public health, live free and die in New Hampshire, because there's no helmet law. And so there the struggle is between the public health community that knows that traumatic brain injury, TBI, one of the leading causes of that is motorcycle accidents. And yet the vigorous protection, if you will, of free will and free spirit by the motorcycle community and their advocates has, and many other states as well, including our own, where motorcycle helmet use is not obligatory. So how can the public health and legal community work together better to promulgate better regulations and better laws ultimately? Let me, before, it's a difficult question.
But you know that law, legal regulation, is a contested terrain, highly contested. Even as we speak of human rights and there is consensus about human rights, in practice, human rights are denied every day. So in the situation of like Nepal, I don't have any details and I can't comment intelligibly around that issue, but it's entirely possible that there is contestation around that from the government perspective, from human rights constituency, and it implicates, as she says, competition in terms of conflict of human rights issues. But we must always know that law is a highly contested terrain, and even what I was surprised, I don't know whether this information was correct, I was reading not a long time ago that the United States hasn't ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, together with Somalia, and I nearly fell from my chair, but it only speaks to the fact that there is contestation around rights issues, and there will be a reason why a democratic state will refrain from a convention of such a nature.
You don't expect me to defend my country, do you?
And I expect you to clarify. I expect you to clarify whether this literature I read is correct or not.
I don't know, but
Yeah.
I would assume we're guilty as charged, Your Honor. Yes, sir. We'll bring you the microphone.
I'm sorry I'm late because I was at a different forum. But thinking of the point that you raised a few minutes ago about regulations and the effect of regulations on health and in general of any activity. In my corner of the world, which is in fact the same as Angela's, regulations mean two things: problems and costs. I would like to know if the general sense in the rest of the world has been that regulations have improved rendering good health services to population, particularly to low-level populations in the world. And when I was coming into the meeting room, there was a mention of Cuba. I'd like to know if what they say about Cuba is true, that at least one thing are doing fine in Cuba that has to do with health. So maybe the question or the point is, do regulations do good for rendering of health services around the world?
Well, I went to Cuba last year with a delegation from my university, and we visited many public health and university officials, and I can tell you firsthand that the universal access to basic primary health care with an emphasis on prevention is absolutely, most certainly, the reason why the infant mortality rate and life expectancy in Cuba is closer to Norway than to most countries in Latin America or even North America. Now the role of law versus policy, to me, that's a different issue. I don't think that health status relates to the rule of law. It relates to good policy, good investment in primary care. On the other hand, if you're dying of an obscure cancer, a rare form of cancer, you may not, in fact, have the same access to experimental and expensive drugs. I know you will not in Cuba, especially because of the American boycott, will not have access to those drugs and likely have a worse outcome than if you were in Texas with that same condition. So it's a decision that a society has to make. Well, in Cuba, we assume they don't have enough money to Oh, you mean in Texas? Oh, in Texas you might not get it either, of course. By the way, of the leading public health interventions that have saved the most lives over the last 150 years, I know what they are and you know them too. One of them is a direct result of the law, and I'll end with that one. But the first one was environmental or sanitation, the improvements at the turn from the 19th to the 20th century. And of course there were regulations there, solid waste disposal. The second was vaccination and the development of vaccines later, but still in the early 20th century. We're talking millions of lives saved in every case. Then the middle of the 20th century with antibiotic therapy, basic antibiotic therapy. And not until laws were changed to require seatbelt use. Now that's a United States example, but I think it's worldwide as well. So the change in the law about seatbelt use is estimated by now to have saved as many lives as each of those other interventions and discoveries going back in time. So the law matters. But you cannot say that without a seatbelt law, there is no rule of law. That's a different issue. But another reason why the legal profession and the public health profession need to be working more intimately. Any other themes or topics we haven't covered? This is a huge span, and we want to be sensitive to the audience here and address things that you may be interested in or other things. Mr. Hubbard. That's the only hand that went up. Oh, looking for the microphone.
Dr. Pastides, your discussion about the seatbelt law just triggered in my mind, and I wondered if we had some time to explore the correlation between gun control measures and public health, and what the experience is in some of the countries around the world if they have a more serious background check protocol, or if they limit the kinds of weapons someone has, or have limits on concealed carrying permits and those sorts of things. I know it's a raging debate in the United States. Any real discussion about sensible gun control is usually squashed by a lobbying group called the National Rifle Association. And even after tragedies, we're unable to come to any real consensus. And it's been a change in the culture of our country, because after the President Kennedy assassination, a number of laws were passed that limited access to rapid fire guns and guns with the ability to fire quickly and that had magazines that carried lots of bullets. And a lot of those laws have actually been rolled back over time under the argument that it would violate the amendment of the Constitution, which is in the U.S. is the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. So I'd be interested in hearing from other countries the experiences there with gun control, and if there's a correlation there to health outcomes.
Is anybody knowledgeable about this? I know of one cross or international study looking at southern Canada versus northern United States, Detroit, Michigan, I think, versus Windsor, Ontario. And first of all, it is in fact true that people kill. And so there's a lot of killing that happens in Windsor, Ontario too. Not to get gory about it, but it's not, it's not as often by gun, but it is by knife and pickaxe and motor vehicle and things like that. But the results of the study were that guns are a more effective tool for killing. And so that the attempt to murder is somewhat similar, but the effectiveness in the ability to murder is far different. And so when you think of two guys in a bar, one with a gun in Detroit, one with a knife in Windsor, the likelihood that the one with the gun will actually kill his victim is much higher. But the attack might be, the difference in the, if you will, the intent to murder is not that different. But of course, it is true that guns are unfortunately effective killing weapons. So, is there any other country represented in the room where the gun laws are as tolerant as in the United States? Are we the only country left where there is essentially unlimited, we don't have universal access to health care, but we do to guns? No other country? In Africa, do you know the continental scene well enough, would you say? Judge, no. No. Angela, do you know South America well enough?
Sin Juan was.
There's many countries with plenty of weapons,
Yeah?
but not allowed.
Oh,
Like
yeah.
in Colombia. I mean, there's the law is that they are not allowed, but there are plenty.
Illegal.
Illegal. But it does make a difference, because if the criminal wants to get a gun, the criminal gets a gun anyway. But the availability, what Angela, you have referred to it in other, in certain segments of the population, or in certain segments of the city, not the population, but the city, the Friday night party ends up in the hospital. And the Friday night party with a gun ends up in the morgue.
Well, actually, there are two things. One is a general prohibition on weapons. In our country, Colombia, yes, we have a general prohibition on certain weapons like, fire, machine guns and pistols, etc. But besides that, you have other weapons, like machetes, for instance. The long, everybody uses them at the fields, where you have sugar cane crops, for instance. You have a lot of machetes, and there you have a lot of crime with those type of weapons. But the truth is that prohibitions on weapons do not have much an effect in our countries, because everybody who needs them carries them.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the main argument in the United States for not restricting them. There are so many out there now. The only people without them will be the law-abiding people. And it's hard, frankly, to counter that because the bad guys are not giving up their weapons.
And
So.
another thing in Colombia is we have so many security guards because of the violent situation of the country. So there are firearms everywhere. We have in every single building there is a guard at the entrance of the university. At each of the entrance of the university is a guard with a gun everywhere. So
England
lots
has
of guns.
changed a great deal too. I remember growing up seeing the bobbies with a stick, but never with a weapon. Never had a weapon, and now you walk around London, and they certainly do. That's very, very sad.
Mm-hmm.
Is it a comment from Germany? Oh.
First?
Yes, I think your hand was up.
I'm coming from growing up in the U.S.
Uh-huh.
and having coming in from a rural community where guns were prevalent and also for hunting, and living in Germany for the last 14 years and seeing the amount of the fact that you have a mentality that would say in the States that guns, it's not the gun's fault, it's the people who hold them. Yet so many incidental deaths are caused and maiming is caused by firearms in the hands of someone. So I think yes, criminals, I agree that criminals do get the guns in either case, and crimes are committed. But I wonder about how many crimes that were not intended that become the consequence of those who hold arms, and safety for all of our citizens that is protected by not having every citizen have the availability to hold a weapon.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yes, back to Nepal from Berlin.
Get his hand up first.
Ah, in the back. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm from Honduras. And
Yes.
in my country, one person can be 5 guns legally, but anyone can take a gun and kill a man for $500, no? Entonces, the violence is so high, no?
Yes, and the prevalence of weapons so high as well.
Every year we celebrate the No Tobacco Day, or the World Tobacco Day, you know, the WHO standard. And every year the government increases taxes for alcohol and tobacco. Now, isn't it a double standard policy of the government? Because you want the revenue to be generated from this tobacco and alcohol companies, but at the same time you talk about protecting the health of the citizens. So, where is the correct answer? How do you handle this, you know?
But the raising of the taxes ought to discourage the acquisition of these products.
Doesn't help.
Yeah, and especially if you take the increased taxes and put them into tobacco or alcohol control, I think that's a good thing. I think there's no doubt that some of the decline, at least in tobacco consumption, has to do with the expense of the acquisition to cigarettes. They used to be 40, 50 cents a pack. I don't know what they are today. They went up to $1 a pack. I'm guessing they're $4 or $5. I don't know, but I would guess they're probably $4 or $5 a pack. And this and many other public health educational interventions have caused the decline. Of course, the tobacco companies will move their products to the developing world. Not that they needed them, because there are plenty of cigarette companies around the world as well. What about alcohol consumption? In the U.S., we raised the drinking age to 21. And those of us in universities know that that there is rampant inattention to the law. And of course, that forces the drinking to be more hidden, more in the homes, and as opposed to the bars. And are there any other countries or any other experiences with respect to, we always hear about the French as a prototype where some wine is experienced by a child, maybe diluted with water, and they grow up drinking wine at family celebrations and then eventually at dinner, and they turn 18 and it's no big deal. And in the United States, the day a person turns 21 is a big, big deal, if you know what I mean. And so any thoughts about, if you will, the judge talked about good laws and bad laws. Are there any other examples of bad laws relative to public health?
You know, there is one of the challenges of law sometimes is when it conflicts with political interests. If it conflicts with political interest, then may result in electoral harm. For those who are in charge of the state, there may be certain consequences, and public health considerations may be thrown out of the window. In the part of the world where I come from, where HIV is a real issue, it's a big issue, one of the main killers, and is rampant in prisons, and where sexual orientation, same-sex relationships are frowned upon and criminalized. There's no distribution of condoms in prisons, even if the public health imperative requires it. And they will tell you, and our former president, who is President Mukhai, who is currently chairperson of an AIDS-free generation, the champions, made up of former heads of states, says, I resisted the calls for distributing condoms in prison during my time as president, although I now understand that it's an important public health, is because there are going to be electoral costs. In moving that direction, I was going to be voted out of power. You talk about the restrictions to access to alcohol in the States and it going underground and so forth. That is, sometimes there is a problem with law.
Yes.
In Botswana, for instance, on that particular topic, bars are restricted. There is an age limit, and the opening hours, businesses are very restricted, and so forth and so forth. But it's a big now an electoral campaign issue with those who want to win, the youth who are indulging big time to say we are going to lift this law and throw it out of the window. And I'm sure in a matter of years it will be lifted because there are political consequences to certain laws, even if they may have public health benefits.
Interesting. Yes, one final question we have time for. Sir.
Thank you very much. I'm Thompson Ligoe from Malawi. Listening to everything that has been said, I'm beginning to think that law does not answer everything. Perhaps law is what you resort to when the situation is desperate. Because, for example, take alcohol. When the age limit was raised to 21, you say that people now resort to drinking within the homes and in hiding. There could be a solution to that. And the solution may not lie in having a law to regulate, but maybe other means. Maybe education, maybe the way children are brought up, maybe how people behave, maybe people's moral values, and those things will not come from law, it will come from other people. And perhaps that's why it is most important that when we face these challenges, people from different views, different walks of life, different backgrounds have to come together and look for a common solution or their viewpoint of a solution to the problem. Thank you.
Well, I think that was a wonderful capstone comment. And to reiterate it, law is not the answer in all cases and is usually not even the only answer to anything, but it's only through the use of the law and the rule of law as a tool or a weapon to promulgate at the advances we're looking for in health, the environment, civil rights, social justice, and really every other asset of life. But I think neglecting the law and neglecting the vital importance of a rule of law, certifiable rule of law, makes everything else that we want to do so much more difficult to do. So I would ask the audience to thank the panelists and the panelists to thank the audience as we go out and have some good, healthful coffee and snacks, and maybe we can continue our discussion. So thank you, everyone.